Good afternoon, Chris.
Hey, Kevin, how's it going?
I'm well, and you?
Good, thanks. Good, thanks.
Cool, man. So we are live as we are on screen right now. So just so you know, I just want to sort of introduce today's show. And good afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime Coaching. My name is Kevin Britz. I'm an executive coach and international leadership facilitator and host of the Lunchtime series where we add value to people's lives. Back with us today, we've got clinical psychologist Christopher Kemp. Chris, thanks for joining us again today.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Chris, so to kick it off to one of the big psychological questions that we have out there, and I was just reading up about it again today, is chatting about psychological trauma, which can be defined as a negative event that's overwhelming, but that we don't always necessarily understand or can properly process it. Don't you want to just sort of give us some idea of what trauma and PTSD is?
So I'm glad you highlighted sort of like it's an event that's kind of traumatic, because I think when people think trauma, they often sort of gatekeep the word in the way, and mostly for themselves in terms of what can be traumatic. So I think it's important to expand our definition beyond sort of getting hijacked or being in a car accident or having a close family member pass away or something like that, because trauma, I think especially today, is quite far reaching. And I think one of the big ones is kind of financial trauma that I think a lot of people are feeling right now, which I think is quite a huge one. Money, not having money, being worried about money adds a lot in terms of kind of bigger processes, like sort of worrying about your security or worrying about your family or taking care of yourself. So there's quite a lot of that as well. So I think we need to expand our scope of trauma beyond what might immediately come to mind. Speaking about PTSD, a lot of people are familiar with the term, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And essentially what that is sort of a list of psychological symptoms or impacts that are grouped under that diagnosis that people experience when people might experience, when they've been exposed to some kind of traumatic event. It's probably the longest list of symptoms in the DSM. There's quite a lot that goes into it. Essentially, some of the stuff that you might experience are the one people are most familiar with in terms of like intrusive thoughts. So that's when we talk about flashbacks, nightmares, just obsessing about what happened or sort of rerunning it in your head. There's usually some kind of fear response to any kind of associated trigger. So if, for example, you were in a car accident, you might find just seeing the same car that you were involved in an accident with, or seeing the car of that color or something like that, can trigger something like that in you. A big one is sort of avoidance. So oftentimes you'll avoid that scenario. If you were held up in a shopping center, you might feel afraid to go back to a shopping center. If you were in a car accident, you might be afraid to drive, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, other things you might notice are sort of a heightened sense of arousal, so feeling kind of hypervigilant, so feeling like very on edge and looking around all the time, stuff like that. So I think it's kind of a list of symptoms that most people can probably relate to in some way or kind of make sense of. A lot of people have experienced some kind of trauma and had sort of these kinds of symptoms, whether or not they were mild or severe, or whether they would meet the sort of diagnosis criteria. But you know me, Kevin, I always say I don't worry too much about the exact label. For me, it's more about the experience. So yeah, I don't want anyone to sort of gatekeep themselves in terms of, do I meet the exact criteria for PTSD? It's such a gradient in terms of a traumatic experience, and you are entitled to help, you're entitled to support, regardless of how mild or severe you feel like your symptoms are, really.
Yeah. So in terms of some of the signs associated with it, I know you've touched on some of them now, but I'm just checking. There are emotional signs, from sadness to anger to denial to fear to shame. There are some, this might lead to something like your nightmares or insomnia, difficulty in your relationships, emotional outbursts. In terms of one of the things that come up for me, because I think a lot of the time people people do, and I'm just making a gross assumption here, but do you find that often people have shame in a big way, especially when they've gone through something that they don't necessarily want to talk about, and shame becomes one of those stumbling blocks where it kind of goes, This is the reason why I don't want to talk about it, because I am ashamed. I am shameful of that thing that happened to me last week or last year or when I was 17. Speak to us a bit about what those, I mean, shame as specifically, I mean, that stands out for me, but what are those other emotional signs that sort of we can really pick up on?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to sort of having any kind of unprocessed feeling. And with PTSD, you're often talking about things that sort of remain unprocessed for you, or that maybe you've kind of suppressed, maybe because you felt ashamed. And that kind of stuff tends to make itself known in other ways, like you say, emotional outbursts or irritability or kind of withdrawing from people. That stuff, particularly in terms of like what we call an acute stress reaction. So shortly after something like this has happened, and maybe you're still processing it, still trying to make sense of it, and you might experience some of that. Shame, I think, is complex in the sense that I feel like there's two kind of parts to it, either shame over the actual traumatic event itself. And I think you can get that complicated picture a lot when you're dealing with sexual trauma, sexual assault, rape victims, that kind of stuff. You get a lot of that shame where people struggle to understand what exactly happened, or if they were younger, or if they had some kind of part in it or something like that, which obviously we would say no one ever does, right? No one is ever to blame for being a victim of something like that. But it's such a complex feeling that I wouldn't want to be dismissive of that either. But that's one part of shame in terms of the actual event itself. And I think the other shame that people experience is in terms of their reaction to the event, and I think we've touched on this before with the stigmatization of mental health struggles. People always want to project this image of kind of being strong and having it all together, and when something happens, we want to feel like we can just sort of brush it aside, and we might think that it feels weak or something like that to have this kind of response, and so we're ashamed to talk about it. We're ashamed to talk about having nightmares or flashbacks, or feeling scared to get in a car again or something like that, because we feel like it's embarrassing in some way. And I think a huge part of our discussions, Kevin, and mental health discussions in general, is eliminating as much of that stigma as possible. We can say, hey guys, this is normal. It's really normal to feel this way, and yeah, you're entitled to support. So shame is certainly a big factor, and I think why so much of trauma does go unprocessed, and that's why the PTSD sort of becomes prevalent as well.
In terms of, as you're speaking, I'm just thinking out in my head, I'm like formulating questions here, but essentially, do you often also find that there are big traumas and small traumas, or is trauma? Do we kind of, because I know from my perspective, I've been through a few traumas in my life, and I still have moments where I experience them in real time, kind of going, wow, what was that? I have sort of flashbacks of things that's happened. But essentially, is there such a thing as a small trauma or a big trauma? Like, is there some categorization like that?
So there isn't necessarily, and I think the way I would like to categorize it is almost in terms of people's experience. So I think it's fine for people to say they have sort of a mild stress response or a severe stress response, and what we'd look at there is sort of like, are you having nightmares and it's sort of bothering you, which might be more mild, or really severe, that you can't get to work, you can't get out of bed, it's really impacting your life, things like that. So I think the trouble with sort of categorizing trauma itself as sort of mild or severe is that people then feel like they have an expected reaction. So if I experience a mild trauma in this categorization and I have a severe response, then that's that feeling of shame, or what's wrong with me, why am I taking this so badly, it's just a mild trauma. So I would say that we can certainly speak about people's emotional response in terms of for themselves if they feel like it's mild or severe, but in terms of the actual trauma, I wouldn't want to make that categorization. I mean, I think that we could come up with ideas of what we think, but the truth is that it's totally subjective, and that everyone experiences these things differently. Some people go through events that we would think of as majorly traumatic, and for whatever reason, they just don't have much of a response to it, whereas some people go through something and it just has this major impact on them. And I think regardless of which one of those categories you fall into, it's okay. I think that we just want to normalize any sort of stress response and say it's okay to feel this way and get support for it.
In terms of, I've got a question online that's just come through as well. But before we get to that question, I just want to ask, do you think as the world, South Africans, people as a whole, do you think we even realize the amount of trauma that we've been through in the last 6 months, considering COVID? I think a lot of the time when I speak to people, people know that because we're coping, and I use that in inverted commas, but because we're coping and we sort of taking that approach, and we see everyone else is kind of doing it, so I'm probably fine, but COVID in itself has been severely traumatic to our lives, and severely traumatic in a big way, and it's okay to kind of go, yeah, this is not okay, and I'm not okay.
So I think in general, even beyond COVID, South Africans in general deal with a huge amount of trauma. Our level of trauma from a psychological perspective is often quite astounding to people from other countries. So people from other countries will actually come to South Africa to train in terms of trauma. So things like child sexual abuse and stuff like that, people will come from overseas because the amount of cases we have of that is astronomical, and you can get so much experience in that. We have some of the best trauma surgeries in the world in a medical perspective. Our trauma surgeons go all over the world to train people because they're dealing with, gunshot victims on a daily basis, whereas if you are in some small European country, like a gunshot comes in once every 6 months or something like that. Yeah. So I think we have become so desensitized to the amount of trauma that we actually face. A colleague of mine that I work with the other day was shot, and thank goodness she's fine, but I was reflecting on the way we all reacted to it, and obviously we're all like, oh my God, that's terrible, how are you doing? But it was almost the same as if she'd kind of been in a car accident or something like that, and we were just concerned for her safety. I think in many other places in the world, the idea of someone being shot in itself would be like just astounding and just completely out of this world, kind of baffling, something that you really are never exposed to. So yeah, I think we're very desensitized to the amount of trauma that we face here. A lot of people live in very traumatic environments, poverty, domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual abuse. As we know, sexual assault and sex crimes in South Africa are unfortunately some of the highest in the world. Yeah. And so we've got children exposed to that. I see a lot of child sexual trauma in my work. So yeah, it's a very, very different environment. And I think that it's like you say, that sort of line of what is normal or what is sort of everyone else is coping with does keep moving. And we place this expectation on ourselves to kind of deal with it. And very seldomly do we sort of take a step back and go, hey, actually, this is like really something that I'm going through. So for me, my focus is always on the individual's experience. So you don't have to underpin your experience with rationalizations or reasons. You don't have to decide whether or not what you're feeling is okay based on if you're allowed to feel that, if the trauma was enough. What you feel is what you feel. And if you are feeling traumatic psychological symptoms, that's enough to warrant you getting help. You don't need to further question whether or not you should be. Whether you should be doesn't matter. The fact is that you are.
So in terms of the question that we have online here, someone's asking, Ingrid is asking, how do we do national therapy, if that's even possible, on South Africans, for example, and how is this going to affect the nation in the future? Is there a way that we can start as an individual, having these sessions online and speaking about it, I think is vital, and bringing an obvious conversation around it is vital. But is there a way that we can have sort of national therapy? Is there a way that we can make, or we could do more about this?
So I think that it's so difficult for many reasons. Mental health care access in South Africa is very, very limited. 100% it is. When I worked at a government hospital, we had waiting lists for months for therapy and things like that. And I think one of the massive problems is that therapy is something that is very much, I would say, required. Mental health is extremely important. The problem that we face here is that there are so many people who aren't meeting their basic needs. So basic healthcare needs, basic security needs, basic survival needs like food and water and things like that. So it's almost like this pyramid of needs. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs that many people are familiar with, you sort of need to satisfy the basics first before you can sort of get into the ideas of self-actualization, of happiness. Really, a lot of people in this country are fighting just for survival. And so until we can get that right, the idea of everyone in the country having access to therapy is unfortunately idealistic. And I don't say that dismissively, I just say that realistically. I think it would be fantastic, but at the moment, we don't even have everyone having access to food, running water, education, decent health care. So there are so many obstacles that we have to overcome. I wish there was more access to mental health care. Organizations like SADAG are obviously trying their best to service on a national basis and refer people, but even SADAG has limited resources, and they are essentially referring people to people in their area, and resources in those areas can be limited. So yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and one that I would love to answer in a positive kind of way. I just think that we have so many obstacles that as a country we have not overcome yet. And so it feels like it's a great step, but we aren't even there yet. We're at the point where we can prioritize that, because there's things that are even on a lower level required that haven't been met yet.
So and another question, how do we help our kids right now? Because as much as, we're struggling as parents, what do we do in terms of our kids being behind masks and shields, and having to now deal with school in this way? Because to a large degree, that's a lot of trauma for them as well. They don't get to do sporting events, they don't get to see their friends, they don't everything. Is there something that we can practically do to assist our children and just our brains, ourselves at this time?
So it definitely depends on how old your kids are, because when we're talking about kids, different ages have massive differences in how you might approach something. But in terms of younger kids, so I'm thinking like before teenage years, 10, younger, that kind of thing. Kids very much look to their parents for how they should feel about things. So if their parents are scared, they're scared. And if their parents are comfortable, they're kind of comfortable a lot of the time. So they're really looking to you for cues on, what am I supposed to feel about this in any kind of foreign environment? So I think that what you'd really want to do is try and normalize the mask thing as much as possible. Try and, be totally comfortable with it, and you can even try make it fun in some way. I've seen so many masks and shields and stuff that have like these funny designs on them and stuff like that for kids, which I think is great, because you're taking away this sort of like healthcare fear of it and just turning it into a thing. Like it's a fun period where everyone's doing this thing and we all wear our masks and whatever. But I think that as much as you can engage with your kids as possible is obviously great. And I know how difficult that can be with work and everything else in the way. But kids generally, young kids express their emotions through play. That's why a lot of psychologists will kind of do play therapy. So it's great if you can play with them, and all you really have to do is just be totally present and acknowledge what they're doing, or try and acknowledge their feelings. So if they're banging a hammer on something, you can say, wow, it seems like you're really angry with that thing, or whatever the case may be. But just in terms of, engaging with them, letting them know that you are observing them, that you are with them, that you invested in what they're doing, and try to make the whole environment as comfortable as you can, even though it is pretty uncertain times. Obviously, teenagers you can have a conversation with, and that makes it a lot easier. So I encourage you to check in with them. Teenagers don't like talking, so you can kind of make a time every week, like Sunday at 6:00 for half an hour. Every week we sit down and we discuss how you're doing, and we have to sit there for the half an hour whether you want to or not, and that's kind of your time. So setting aside time like that can be really good, because sometimes if you just ask over dinner or during the course of the day, hey, how you doing, they can be like, yeah, fine, and then you just kind of move on. So it's good to set aside a specific amount of time that's sort of fixed, that everyone has to sit there, no phones, sit there, engage, we're discussing how you're doing, even if you think you are lame or annoying.
Yes. Chris, in terms of trauma in a relationship, trauma in your work environment, very often I've come across this, I've experienced it, where trauma becomes normal, and we become accustomed to the horrendous, like we have about South African. There's so much, in South Africa, as you mentioned earlier. But how do I know that that's what's happening to me and the trauma I'm experiencing? How do I get reference in myself to be able to cope with that? Because for example, when someone finds themselves in a really, really bad relationship, for example, they're there, they stay there, and it almost becomes their routine of maybe abuse or that kind of thing. How do I kind of step back and go, wait a minute, let me have a look at this, and the trauma that I'm experiencing is not okay, and I need to do something. How do I get there?
So I think a lot of that definitely comes down to what we were talking earlier about in terms of like gatekeeping your feelings. I think the only thing that you need to examine in a relationship is, are you happy? Are you satisfied? Are you fulfilled in that relationship? And if you are not, that is enough of a reason to engage with that and say, okay, I'm going to set boundaries. I need things to change, or maybe I need to leave this relationship. I think what happens, especially when people are stuck in traumatic relationships, is they kind of blame themselves and they say, okay, well, this is just this person's personality and I have to deal with that. Or, they'll speak to family members and family members say, oh, you know what men are like, or, my husband was like that as well, or whatever the case may be. And it's sort of dismissive of your experience. So instead of questioning whether or not you should feel something, rather just question what it is that you do feel. So it's kind of a what do I feel rather than a should I feel this way. How you feel is how you feel. I'll always keep saying it. So, you don't have to, that's enough. And that should be enough for your partner as well. If your wife or husband or spouse or partner is unhappy, that should matter to you. That should be enough for you. Why they're unhappy is something that you should want to invest in. And even if you don't necessarily agree with it, you can be right and they're still unhappy. And then what have you really won? So it's not about right or wrong, but it's about, you should want your partner to be happy. And if you're not happy, then that should be a problem. And if you are the partner who's not happy and your partner doesn't seem to care, that's a problem. And that should kind of be a red flag for you. I think that everyone should, sorry, Kevin, last thing is obviously there's non-negotiables, right? Like we would say that any kind of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, if you're experiencing any of that, just try and take a step back and sort of say, is this ever acceptable to me? Am I ever willing to put up with this? Because I would say that you shouldn't be.
And in terms of sorry, I'm just like, as you're speaking, my brain's running at 100 miles an hour.
No worries, yeah.
Can having experienced trauma, past trauma, and not having to really deal with it in a way, can this lead to other mental disorders? So can this maybe make me severely depressed because I haven't dealt with that trauma? Like, do you correlate trauma to other mental health issues?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, especially so many mental illness, mental health issues are correlated as trauma is kind of like a risk factor. If you've experienced trauma, you're more likely to experience depression. You're more likely to experience bipolar, anxiety, schizophrenia, so many different things. So absolutely, that's the case. And often we talk about comorbidity, which kind of means that having one mental illness and another as comorbid, which means you're kind of experiencing both. So like depression and anxiety are often comorbid, and certainly PTSD and the impact it can have on your life can certainly lead to depression as well. So for me, like I say, it's all about your experience and what you're going through, and just making sure that you're getting kind of the support that you need. So if you're unsure of what's happening for you, but you know that it's not you, you know that you're not okay, go and chat to a professional and find out what kind of help is available to you.
Chris, in terms of getting some help for this, I know that cognitive behavioral therapy is one of them. Through my reading up on this, I also saw that desensitization movement and reprocessing can also help. Don't you just want to touch on some of the areas that we can, and what CBT and desensitization movement is?
So CBT is one sort of modality of therapy that its main focus is kind of how your thoughts impact your behavior. So the idea is that to deal with things that are happening in your life, you need to sort of rewire the way that you think about things. It's very practical. It's very like you'll get homework and things like that. It's very hands-on. It's usually quite short and focused, and some people get a lot of value from it. Some people would hate it. Some people say, I want to talk about how I'm feeling and I just want a space for people to listen, and I really don't want to do a worksheet. Why are you doing this to me? So I think it's important to get something that feels like a good fit for you. EMDR is much more in the more kind of like specialized realm of things. So it's often used to deal with trauma specifically. So that's not something that you're going to just practice or study at university in the normal course of things. I've never practiced EMDR. I don't know a huge amount about it other than the kind of the basics. So that is something where someone would be like, I am an EMDR therapist. That's what I do. And if you feel like that would work for you, or, they are saying, hey, we can really help with trauma and give this a try, then absolutely, that's something that you can try as well. I have heard good things about it, specifically in the treatment of trauma. So certainly worth trying. But that is one of the sort of specialized things that people kind of use, particularly in terms of trauma.
Fantastic, Chris. Thanks. And as we always do, and I know that mental health, there are very similar ways and tips and tricks to take care of yourself. But if you could leave us with some tips today, and just to deal with trauma a little bit more effectively, what would you leave us with for anyone listening and taking away from today's conversation?
Okay, so to start off, I just want to say, if you do experience something traumatic, especially something that you feel like for you is quite seriously traumatic, I really would encourage you to talk to someone professional. Generally with trauma, the earlier you speak to someone, the better the outcomes, the better the kind of prognosis. Even within a couple of days, really it would be beneficial to reach out and talk to someone, especially someone who has experience with trauma, or even a trauma specialist, something like that. But whatever you have access to, it's very helpful, especially very recently after a trauma, speak to someone. That being said, it doesn't mean that if it happened years ago, you shouldn't speak to someone. Absolutely not. It's just that the earlier, the better in general. The next one is to kind of normalize your feelings. We've spoken about this. Don't be ashamed of what you're feeling. It's completely normal and it's completely expected.
And it's like okay. I said, it's okay to feel it.
Yes.
It's okay. Yes.
Absolutely. That's why we say it. Normalize it for yourself. It's okay. Don't be ashamed. Don't feel like it's wrong or weird. Like I said, trauma is so complex because everyone responds differently to different things. It doesn't mean that people that don't experience these symptoms are somehow stronger or anything like that. It's just how you feel is how you feel. Normalize that. Don't be ashamed of it. It's okay, as Kevin says. So reach out for support. This can be friends or family. The idea isn't to ruminate on the details. Constantly repeating the actual experience. There's a bit of controversy around whether or not that's helpful. Some people think that's actually more traumatizing to keep going over the details again and again, but rather process your feelings about it. What are you feeling now? What did you feel then? And how are you coping with it? Don't sit with it just to yourself. Don't be afraid to reach out to others and say, hey, I've actually been having a bit of a tough time with this, and I've been feeling really weird. People should or would hopefully be very understanding because they can relate to that. I think a lot of people can relate to trauma.
Chris, I just want to ask as well, in terms of how I've also experienced it, sometimes people don't need advice. They just need someone to listen to them, right? They don't need someone to solve anything. I just need, there's moments where you go, well, I just need someone to just listen. You don't need to fix me. I just need you to sit there and acknowledge what I'm saying and what I'm going through. And I think that, do you think that's also really useful in terms of going through something like this?
I would say that's kind of the golden rule for anyone listening to a friend or family member offering support. It's counterintuitive, but I'd honestly say like the golden rule is don't try to give advice. Rather reflect the feeling, say, wow, that sounds really scary, or sure, that must be really hard for you. Just try and connect with what that person's feeling, because that's what they really want, is to be heard and understood. Advice can unintentionally come across as dismissive, like you don't understand what they're feeling, or you're saying they shouldn't feel that way because there's an easy solution. So don't try to fix the problem, like Kevin says. Yeah, just be there for them. And that's not just trauma, but really any emotional stuff is kind of the golden rule, I would say, and the easiest way to offer better support.
Fantastic. Chris, believe it or not, that's already been 30 minutes.
Yes, okay.
It's such fun as having these conversations. Chris, if anybody wants to get hold of you, where do we go?
So you can just go to our website. It's cccpsychology.co.za. So it's the letter C twice, psychology.co.za. My name's Chris Kemp. You can find my details on there if you want to email me or shoot me a message, call me, whatever.
Fantastic. Thank you for tuning into Lunchtime Coaching today, and all the video content will be published out on eBiz Radio. Happens every day at lunchtime, guys. So tune in. This session will also be going out on eBiz Radio next week, Tuesday. If you want to find out more, check out the YouTube channel. All this information that we're sharing with you now, all our details will also be in the YouTube video's description. And Chris, thank you for joining me. Thank you for making the time, and thanks for giving us some insight around today's topic.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
We will chat to you next week.
Yeah, see you then.
Chat to you later. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye, everyone.